So just in this region alone, which we call the Mid-Atlantic region, we have the Ujima People's Progress Party is a member of BAP, so is the Maryland Council of Elders, so are the Pan-African Community Action, so is We Charge Colonialism, President of Congo, Claudia Jones, Group for Education. So there are a lot of organizations that are members of Black Alliance for Peace. And because of that, Baltimore, I know, has a plethora of organizations, and a plethora of organizations working around policing. But in the time that I've been organizing in the city, the one thing I found is that we don't speak to each other. So there's people working on the funding, there's people working on community control, there's people working on, like safe haven work, mutual aid, and there's no conversations about how those things align. And I think that leads to a lot of why nothing seems, there's no advancement, because we're all circling the drain around the same issues. So I wanted to get organizers from different organizations together in a room where we could discuss these things in different aspects. How does policing affect your work? What does policing do to the work that you like? How does it impact the work that you're doing? So in that sense, that is why we wanted to have this. It's more so that we did want to speak to community, but it was to invite organizations to come and we find some sort of principles and points of unity that we could all move forward with as we go forward, because we know there's going to be a lot more coming down on us. So I'll just read a bit about what the Militarization of Baltimore Conference is. So on April 7, 2017, the City of Baltimore and the Department of Justice entered into consent decree to resolve the DOJ's findings that it believed that the Baltimore City Police Department had engaged in a pattern and practice of conduct that violated the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution and specific provisions of federal statutory law. Following the demands of the national uprising in 2020 to defund the police, last October, Governor Hogan announced his Refund the Police initiative, pledging $150 million to raise salaries, help agencies with recruitment, pay for body cameras, and de-escalation training and other programs. In January, Hogan said he has upped the amount to $500 million over the next 3 years. So that Baltimore understands that the police are used to enforce the status quo of white power and colonial control over lives of Black, brown, and other oppressed nations of people. Police are constantly well-funded and well-resourced, despite police not being first responders and police not being constantly trained and well-trained in demographic and cultural equities and justice, mental illness services, and medical emergencies. So the Militarization of Baltimore Conference will serve as a space for Black, African-led organizations in Baltimore to come together with the community and contribute to the collective involvement and collective outcomes shaped by resistance to this latest assault on human rights of Black, poor, and working class people. Thank you. I want to invite Kimya and Damien to come up, and then Gasso and Greene. They're going to be our first speakers, if you want to come up.
My name is Damien, by the way. I'm a member of BAP-Baltimore. I've been a member for 2 years, and it's really good to see you guys out here tonight, and I'm going to help moderate these panels. So I'm first going to start by introducing our speakers and reading off our bios. So I want to start with Gasso Gober, I'm sorry. Gasso is a queer, cisgender, able-bodied woman of Sierra Leonean descent, healing from the impacts of internalized racism as a young person and working in the sex industry. She currently occupies the lands of the Lenape peoples, aka Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is attending graduate school or clinical social work and human sexuality education. When they are not processing individual ancestral trauma through decolonizing therapeutic practices, psychoben research, and Black radical queer femme voices, you can find her climbing trees, laying in the sun, singing karaoke, or simply being silly with their cats, Clementine and Tara. So please give a hand for Gasso. And next we have Bri Reed. Bri is a Baltimore native who uses her writing and facilitation skills to tell the truth about the consequences of state violence for Black communities. She currently organizes alongside farmers and other food justice organizers through the South via the Greene Clothe collective. We are politics and is influenced by many anti-imperialist organizers. Please give it up for Pride. Thank you. Now, this panel, we're talking about marginalized communities, so women, youth, and sex workers. Both Gasol and Bride has their own expertise, and we're going to start the panel by giving them time to address you first. So, Gasol, if you want to go first, and they just explain some of your work and how you came to this and what you do for it.
Yeah, appreciate the introduction and appreciate folks that have taken space to come here today to engage these issues. So how can I tie people in the sex trade with the militarization of Baltimore? Right. I first want to uplift an ancestor who passed recently by the name of Brittany Fleming. She was a Black trans woman who was engaged in street-based sex work, and her death I lay at the hands of the Baltimore City Police Department and the state for their negligence. So I wanted to uplift her name. Now, when I think about the reasons why people engage in the sex trade here in Baltimore City, whether it be street-based sex work, whether you are stripping, whether you are engaged in escorting, it is very much because we live within a system that is capitalist, anti-Black, racist, and structured to push people into places where they now have to sell their sexual labor, their emotional labor to meet their housing needs, their food needs, healthcare, education, etc. So when we think about how much money is going to the Baltimore City Police Department right now, I typically uplift how much money is not going to youth violence prevention programs, to substance abuse and mental health programs, to housing, to our public school systems here. And I think about the many reasons why people are pushed into the sex trade. I think about how my parents came from this country, from a war-torn Sierra Leone. I think about the queer young people who are pushed into the sex trade because their parents do not accept the fact that they are queer or trans. And so now they're having to run away at the age of 13, 14, 15 years old and figure out how to survive within a system that is designed to kill them. And so they are now engaging in street-based sex work, camming online, escorting at the ages of 14, 15, and 16 years old. And so when I came to this work, I was working with the Sex Workers Outreach Project here in Baltimore. And we did not have an analysis that was rooted in the need to dismantle imperialism, to dismantle colonialism, to dismantle anti-Black racism on a global scale. So when I think about the militarization of Baltimore and how it connects with people in the sex trade, I also think about the DOJ report where they name that people who are in the sex trade are having to face extortion by the Baltimore City Police Department, right? I am out in the streets engaging in sex work. The police officers are coming to me and saying, if you give me sex, I will not arrest you. That is a dynamic that is rooted in patriarchal violence, right? We know that many people engaged in street-based sex work are also navigating chronic homelessness, are also navigating being formerly incarcerated, are also juggling not only their own personal trauma, but ancestral trauma here in Baltimore City of a wide variety coming from child sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, right? And we know that through the 1033 program, that the Baltimore City Police Department will have access to militarized weapons, assault rifles, tanks. And when we think about what this city really needs to heal, it's not tanks. People involved in the sex trade who were pushed, and I really want to make this known, people in the sex trade here and not only here in Baltimore, but throughout this country and throughout this world, are pushed into the sex trade by the state. The state is the biggest trafficker. I really want to make that clear. The state is the biggest trafficker. When I think of my siblings in Sierra Leone who are having to engage in sex work because of the Civil War, because of Ebola, I also then think, hey, how did the 19th century Berlin Conference, where Western European powers saw Africa like a cake and decided to cut it up for their own exploitation, how did westward expansion traffic indigenous women, children, boys, men, queer people into the sex trade? It is not one individual trafficker that is pushing people into the sex trade. It is the state. And that's what we need to remember. And that's why I ask people who have whorephobia, which is the stigma against people in the sex trade. I implore them to see them as allies. These are individuals who did not want to engage in sex work. I did not grow up wanting to lie beneath a white man who does not even challenge the ways in which he and his ancestors positioned my people, queer people, women, survivors of child sexual abuse, positioned us to have to fend in a capitalist imperialist system with our sexual labor. Shame. We should not be seeing people in the sex trade as lumpen proletariats, right? We should not be seeing them as individuals we need to push out of our communities. We should be asking, why are they engaging in sex work, and how can I, as a neighbor, support them if they want to leave? So my position with Swap Baltimore for the longest time is that we had to decriminalize the sex trade, not only for people selling sex, but people buying sex. That is no longer my position. We also need to challenge why predominantly men, predominantly rich white men, feel like they have to assuage their loneliness, assuage their sexual desire through the patriarchal violence of purchasing sexual services from people who are already struggling with so much. And so thank you.
Right, so my name is Bree. I'm Baltimore born and raised for the majority of my life. I spent some time in other parts of this colonized land for undergrad and stuff like that, but being born in West Baltimore, going to elementary school in West Baltimore, going to middle school in North Baltimore, and then high school in East, and experiencing the ways that youth are engaged throughout those different geographies sparked something early on in thinking about the ways that it shows up when you're young, right? Like you recognize which schools get the best, it starts little, right? Like field trips, like who gets invited to go to North Bay and who doesn't. Which schools get invited to do honor band programs, right? Because you have the music funding and there's backing between all of these arts programs that fund certain schools to do certain things and leave out other schools from doing other things. And so when you're a young Black girl in Baltimore City, if your whole family has been raised in this city and your whole family has gone through whether it be parochial school or different public school structures, and you see the ways that your cousins are engaged with by the public school system, which then turns into the state, right? The way that an IEP gets neglected, and then that turns into a social worker, and then that turns into mass incarceration, and then that turns into and again and again and again. And then you see the ways that the state functions in all of your friends' lives, right? When you're little, and you're noticing the ways that certain people are encouraged to do CTY through Johns Hopkins, right? And you're taught all of these things, and you're invited to do these programs, and they're teaching you which kids are gifted and talented and which kids are worth being funded. And then you grow up and you become a young adult and a young person in Baltimore City, and you notice that these things aren't just about which middle school gets funded, right? Like Roland Park versus Mount Royal versus again and again and again, et cetera. And then you get the high schools, right? And the codification of high school students of who gets to go to a city and a Poly, and who goes to a Merville and a Douglas and an Augusta Fells. And you become a young person, and you take all of these things in as you're trying to figure out how you're going to participate in a community. because now you're graduating high school and everybody's looking at you and you're supposed to know what you're going to do and where you're going to fit in. But all of these programs your whole life have been telling you the way you succeed in this city is doing an internship with the state's attorney's office, right? Or doing a program that takes young people to Israel, right? And codifies it as legitimate, right? Because those are the things that your teachers bring into your classroom. Those are the things your principal leaves infographics and applications for in the guidance counselor's office, right? Certain universities get invited with more, I want to say zest, but it's like hype, right? Like folks act differently in your high school when the Johns Hopkins, right, point of contact person is coming in versus CCBC. And all of these things are teaching you what gets rewarded and what gets excitement even when you're young. And so that's part of the reason why when I think about my journey through organizing, a lot of it has been observation and in observing how class and geography and your proximity to the state, right, whether it be foster care or social workers like home checks, CPS, and all of these things shape a politic because they're shaping the way that you recognize the state and who's taught how and when to recognize the state. And so when we have panels like this and we're talking about where young people fit into organizing, I really want to make clear the way that like some people are marked by the state as having a purpose and having a reason for being worthy of investment in this city from a very, very young age. And that sticks with you, right, in an emotional way and in a material way, because it continues to ripple, because a lot of these systems and structures are surrounding like people full of institutional knowledge, right? Like people don't lose or move positions in city offices or city programs. And if you made this connection with one person when you were in high school, during this program where you get to go to Israel, right, and you're learning about the world because you're being taught that you need to go beyond this country and learn something about this place, right, this big old world, but you don't have enough money to do that because most people in Baltimore City don't make enough to have a passport for themselves, let alone buy passports for their children. And so when a program comes and they're willing to give you passport assistance and application assistance and walk you through, right, what does it mean, globalization, right, and you're learning all of these things, and you're like, I understand. But it's for a particular aim because then you're 20-something, right? And you're taught that you need to consider more than just going somewhere as an opportunity to learn something, but why? Why are we taking young Black kids from Baltimore City Public Schools over to Israel, right? Why are we teaching them these things about how to engage with other lands and other people's oppression? And so that's just like the basics of like when I think about what I want people to know about me, a lot of it is just I've lived here. And I've seen how this place has interacted with me and my cousins and my friends in the ways that it teaches us we matter and the way it completely disregards us if we're of no utility to it. So that's my intro.
Thank you. So I'm Kenya Nuru Dennis. I'm a member of BAP-Baltimore. And so I'm going to ask some questions, and David and I are going to ask questions. So we're going to start off with this important question for our communities. Why is it important for our communities to understand the importance of protecting the most vulnerable sex of our communities, such as women, children, LGBTQIA, sex workers, domestic violence, and examples such as Donnell Rochester? And either of you can go first.
Yeah, I think that, so wanting to uplift Donnell Rochester, for folks who don't know, was a queer Black man who was murdered by the state, murdered by Baltimore City Police Department, had yet to go to prom, just so much was taken from him when he was murdered by the state, and just wanting to really sit with that. And to speak to the question that you raised, we can see how imperialist, capitalist, white supremacists here in Baltimore City and across this world use marginalized peoples. We use women, use children, use queer people, use people who are selling sex, use people who are using drugs to divide us, to divide and conquer, to make you think the person who has gone to school, you've never done sex work, you've never done drugs, you're not queer, you're not trans, you're straight, to make you feel superior to those people who the imperialist, that the capitalist, that the white supremacist wants to position as beneath you, to further divide us and forget that we are all underneath the heel of neoliberal capitalism that wants to literally destroy our bodies for their benefit. So when we position those people as beneath us, it's easier for us to call the Baltimore City Police Department. It's easier for us to throw them in jail. It's easier for us to blame their entire condition on themselves alone, which we know is an individualistic capitalist concept. How can we begin as a community to engage in mutual aid? Lend our hands to our brothers, our sisters, our siblings who are struggling before calling the cops. If we in our communities know that domestic violence is going on, how do we not call the cops? How do we reach out to other individuals who are dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence, supporting survivors of child sexual abuse, so we can create alternative healing pathways, mutual aid, and not send them to the state to be used as an enslaved person in the prison industrial complex? So that's what I would like to.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would add that the phrasing is why we must protect the most vulnerable.
Yes, so why is it important for this to be the priority of protecting the most vulnerable?
Right. The first thing that comes to mind is they're not our enemies, right? Because the way that we're taught to think about protection or confrontation or violence is in a binary, right? Like someone is either in community with you or not. And there's, again, this schema where you go through and they teach you how to identify that, right? Like, where is their moral fiber, right? Where do they sit on these realm of questions around, like, children's well-being, animal well-being? Do you care about the environment, right? And it's in these binaristic ways of, like, who has the perfect language and who has the means to gain access to understanding what even are the parameters of what I'm trying to get at is just like, they're not your enemy. And the reason we must like protect them, right? And it's not this protection that is rooted in patriarchal, just like they're mine, right? And that's why I must protect them. But we are here together. It goes beyond like this, I must protect you because you are more vulnerable than me. And that means you are weaker, right? In terms of like that power relation. But like, we are all at some point going to be harmed by the state. You are being harmed right now because there has been a long history of material conditions and just like psychological preparation, right? So that the world is against you. And so even beyond or like digging deep into the question, it's not like this you before me, right? It's like this portion of your identity makes you really, really vulnerable to state violence. And it's in my interest to pay attention to the way that state violence is harming you and violating you, because they will use those same tools and those same material conditions to violate me once they find the way that they can get consent to do so, right? Once they find a way to create communities of other people who will not care, who disavow my humanity in the ways that they're disavowing your humanity. And so not looking at it as like we have a duty to protect, because if we do not occupy the identities and the experience of being queer, being disabled, being a sex worker, like we're safe in that sense of like you first, me later. But we're all occupying this fractal where state violence is just bouncing around, and at some point you'll get hit.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so our next question, keeping in vein with that, protecting our most vulnerable, we know that young Black youth are really vulnerable in our community. And after you had the 2020 uprising of George Floyd's, there were radical calls of defunding the police. But once that kind of quieted down, there were now calls of an increase in crime and the need to give more funding to the police. And a lot of those calls are aimed directly at Black young people who are kind of scapegoated into being these criminals that we need to use the police for. And in Baltimore, we see that with the young kids, the squeaky kids that sit at these lights that you drive by, and they don't have anything for them, so they put them on those corners. And so the question, I say all that to say, the question, how has the overt criminalization of the youth helped to hurt solutions? How has the overt criminalization of the youth helped or hurt solutions to make Baltimore safe?
The overt criminalization. I think the most blatant examples are when you get it starts in like places that youth are able to occupy, right? You're thinking of young people who are largely Black and brown, enrolled in Baltimore City Public Schools, and you're telling them that their rec centers are closed, that their after-school programs won't be funded, that you can work if you work through Youth Works largely, right? And they have that program set up in combination with different businesses and offices around the city. So again, there's this sort of like undertone of whose business, whose org is eligible to be a Youth Works partner org, right? And so you get all of these ways that, again, young people are taught like what you have to do to have enough money to do what you want to do. And then the free places you can go to just be and occupy, right, are points of hyper surveillance. Like when you're young and you start noticing at Towson, like the signs popping up telling you that you can't be here without somebody over 18 past like 6, 7 o'clock. What can you do for free? Like when you're young and you're Black and you're broke. Because when you're young and you're Black and you're broke, you still have a right to live a human life, which includes pleasure and laughter and joy and just being able to gather with your friends, right? Because we also know, as we've referenced, child sex abuse is happening, right? And you just want to be out of your house, right? We recognize the way that neighborhoods are hyper-policed, and so you don't want to stay on your block after such and such a time because you already got this blue light watching you in the sky that hasn't been on since 2001, but the power is still on, right? And so the blue light is flashing, and you're under this panopticon of like, they're watching me. And so you want to go somewhere like the Inner Harbor, right, where it's brightly lit, right, and you can see the water and hear the waves, and there's bright colors, and there's people playing music, and you want to be, but now they're watching you at the harbor, and you can't go, right? And you can't really go there anyway because only the T-Mobile store was open in the gallery, right? And you got maybe Hooters and California Pizza Kitchen, maybe Cheesecake Factory. And so you have all of these price points where youth are taught how they engage and how they can go about participating in their communities. And that's criminalized, right? You get caught up in a paddy wagon after 8 o'clock, and now if somebody isn't home to come get you, you're at baby bookings until Monday, right? Or your mom is working at Mount Sinai or some hospital or Good Samaritan, right? And she's working a 7 to 7, and now she has to leave work, so she's pissed. And now you're grounded. And all of these ways that criminality is left as this black and white option of if you're just outside being, laughing, right, in a way that somebody doesn't like. Somebody can take issue because we have the surveillance measures against children to do so. We have these ways that we teach Black children, if we cannot keep eyes on you, and we being the state, right, not trusted people in your community who have loved you and who have nurtured you, right, and if we gave them funds, they would know what you need in your communities, right, because we're taking away your basketball hoops, right, and transplants are moving into your communities and calling the police because you're too loud, because you're throwing a football across the side street and they're afraid you're gonna knock off their side window. And so there are all of these points where young Black children are put up against the state and they're not gonna win. They're just not gonna win, right? Because the public defender's office is too crowded, right? And because we keep closing schools like Augusta Fells and we don't give them after school programs and we don't tell them that they matter, right? But we have all of these routes of putting them right back in the hands of the state. And so I think it definitely, it only hurts more and more when you think about the momentum that 2020 was in engaging youth and young people around conversations of political education. And then again, here the state comes, right, in different clothing, right, from different points of access to young people and communities and telling you, we don't have the means to help you live a good life, but we definitely have the means to lock you up. And we're gonna show you all these new tech toys that the folks who are moving into your communities are actually helping us build, because all of the good new software that they're developing for us, right? All of the ways that they're able to pick up on your vernacular, right? All of the ways that they're able to study you on TikTok and on Twitter, and all of these things are gonna help us build more and more technology to recognize and criminalize your behavior. And so the very reason you want to get out of your neighborhood, right? Because you can't do nothing without the white lady who lives next door calling the police on you. She's also building the tech software that's used, right, to find your face underneath the mask, right? She's also building the tech software that's gonna sell your data, right? And the police are gonna have access to review your TikTok video, right? That just so happens to have your cousin who they were already looking for in the bag, right? And so it's just, I think about policing in the ways that young people are particularly vulnerable, because we are also teaching young people that the only way that they can have a future, capital A, capital F, is if they get in with the state in partnership before they're in it in a cage.
Thank you so much. All right, so this is time for you all. If you have any questions or thoughts that you want to share? I know y'all thinking stuff. I saw your eyebrows raised and everything. Good here, man.
Thinking back to what you said about, I think, the music programs at the different schools. I am local, I'm from Columbia. I was local in high school, and I can relate to the honors program, like with verification on schools, and when I used to go to honors days, because right when I was in middle, it was at, I think, Long Beach and Hammond, Lakes, where the honors band was comprised of all the schools outside of Columbia in that area. Even though it was like two more schools outside of the Hill, they were more majority white versus what the middle and Columbia schools, which are 40% black. So where you on that level, Howard County, Columbia is supposed to be like the next America. You got most of them children there. I think almost like 30% of them live in apartments nearby there. That's why they live in the suburbs nearby the school. And similar to that, because in the honors band, I think I was only one of like 3 people out of like 40 or 35, and all the rest of them were from like out of Columbia schools, such as like Centennial, River Hill, Howard, all that. So I can relate what you said. I didn't even know, ignorant myself, I didn't know the extent on Howard County where the city had that student also going to children's, because same thing there.
Yeah, and North Bay got a lot to answer for to a black family. And so also thinking about that in the ways that like young people, even when they're given opportunities to experience things that are new and ecological, and look at the ways that STEM education interacts with the environment, and look at this fun opportunity to do all of this with your friends. If something happens to a young black child, folks don't feel the need to answer to the community for the ways that they're responsible for that. And it definitely stems beyond like Howard County, Montgomery County, because it's rooted in the fact of like, how are we approaching community funding in a world where we also have redlining that has just like, we mastered it. Like, we gave other people the blueprint, right? And it again and again makes me think of what calls we're giving people, especially young people, about the way that they can participate. Because like you said, like, somebody can have a totally different experience of an honors band program, and that propels their whole life, right? And their participation in that gets them opportunity after opportunity, and it's just like, so many kids are left out because they don't live in the right neighborhood. And a lot of people don't see an issue with that because that's the way it's always been.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, experiences?
I'd like to raise something you just said, like, what redlining that Baltimore, like the front row for. So Anne Arundel County now has, the last 2 years, GTPL, like you have your own city passport. So I'm wondering, do you, like, I know this is like about Baltimore, but are we understanding Baltimore as like a hub in the way that they choose to interact with the rest of the state? Because even when we talk about UCF, one of the officers was from General County. I went to high school. So I'm familiar with that, but just see that coming here and then see what's happening with Liberty, with the light rail, and the fight to keep the light rail out of Liberty. I'm just wondering if you see the sort of policing and if we're understanding that sort of coordination of Baltimore, like expanding the state in that same way.
Yeah, and I think it goes exactly to the point you're making, Erica, about like where police officers are from, and not to say that like I know there's this whole push that one of like the police reform options that people are pushing for is like hire more Baltimore-based police. I don't want them to exist, period. So like that caveat doesn't really matter to me, but I think it really matters in the sense of the ways that the media, the local news media that's engaging with folks there, and the way that local news media in other counties and parts of the Mid-Atlantic that aren't here have a really insidious way that they make sure you remember that this is like the hellmouth, right? Like, don't come here, do not, if your friend lives in Bowie, they already have this idea that they can't drive an hour and hang out with you because this is a different type of place, right? Like this is some Gotham City ass like location. And I think that is what's particularly insidious about BPD's commitment to like recruiting from Pennsylvania, right? And Anne Arundel County and all of these other places is because they know that. And it helps their game, right? The Wire being one of the most popular TV series to ever hit a television screen, propaganda went up. Like, they've minking since then because people are attached to this fictionalized version of Francis Scott Key, right? And, right, those aren't real kids. This can't be, like, completely rooted in the ways that Baltimore has been engaged since it had the largest population of free Black people in the Mid-Atlantic and on the East Coast, right? Like, this cannot be rooted in any sort of liberal myths about America and freedom and what it means to live here. No, this is just a show, right? And then you get these wire tours and you get this, like, emotional attachment that people have to this idea that BPD exists not only in this literal fictional show, but then you get 2015 and you get the fiction comes to life on CNN. And so all of this confirmation is happening about this place that local news media and even national news media now in 2015 and onward are biting at of like, ooh, we know that whenever we need to make a point about the moralistic purpose of police, we got two go-tos, Baltimore and Chicago. And we know every time when things are getting low, when it's looking dicey, we can pull those out. We can pull stories from those places out, and we can show you, look how many of their high school students aren't reading on grade level. Just randomly, in the middle of their news cycle, in the middle of their week, because they need something to constantly remind people what's happening. And so I think that that media piece, coupled with the ways that a lot of people aren't familiar with how police get funded and how police funding should be something that they are actively looking into, is the reason why you get instances where everybody went to high school with somebody who works at BPD, but everybody didn't grow up in Baltimore City, and everybody doesn't have an understanding of the fundamental violence that the state is monopolizing.
Thank you. Let's get one last question or thought, even if you want to fuss about something.
Please, but
We got centuries of fussing. This one instance. We had two more fusses. Start and then Miss Lisa.
I don't have to do it.
My question was,
You can be up there anyways.
my question was to yourself around your perception of the criminalization of youth and the intersection with sex work and how that manifests.
Yeah. So I wanna uplift the work of Baltimore Safe Haven and Power Inside. Baltimore Safe Haven, for folks who don't know, they are a Black trans-led organization that is supporting people who have been pushed into survival sex work, especially queer youth who, because of transphobia in their families, because of queerphobia in their families, abuse in their families, find themselves engaging in sex work to survive and to meet their needs. So when we think about the intersections of criminalization and the youth, I think I really start to think about how the family is the first institution and the first unit where we can prevent a lot of these things from happening. I think that if within families we have an understanding, one, that our children, we as parents have a duty to children to ensure that they do not end up in the hands of the police department, to ensure that they don't have to travel the school to prison pipeline, the foster care to prison pipeline. How can we as parents, as older people in our children's lives, unpack our own trauma? You know, I hear, wanting to go back to the question around the over-criminalization of children, a lot of older people uplifting the need to spank young people again. We need to be whipping their butts. We need to be spanking them. These youth don't have any discipline. They don't have any, well, we need to have an understanding that when you beat a child, as someone who is beaten, you are changing their brain structure. You are changing their brain structure, and you are setting them up, unfortunately, to not be able to have the resources that they need within their bodies, on top of ancestral violence and epigenetics. You are increasing the likelihood for them to not be able to regulate themselves in a situation where they are already viewed as dangerous. I in my Black body, as a Black boy, Black girl, Black queer person, I am already viewed as a threat. I am already viewed, the system is already set up to kill me or to put me in the Neo Plantation so I could be making police officer uniforms, flags, license plates at 2 cents, 50 cents, $1. So I think it's really up to, as we get, I know as I get older, to challenge the adultism, which is this idea that people who are older and no longer children know what's best for children. How can we start empowering young people, having them understand that you do have bodily autonomy. I do appreciate your mind. I do want to cultivate your mind. So they're not out here thinking. They lack critical thinking. We need to start having conversations with our children, and radical conversations with them. The urgency is here, because when with parents, because they are not teaching in schools how child sexual abuse and incest connects to imperialism and colonialism and anti-Black racism. They're not going to connect that stuff. It's for the elders and older folks to engage those conversations with young people so that they're not criminalized, so that they don't grow up thinking, oh, well, my parents beat me, I'm going to go beat my children, abuse my children. So yeah, good question, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read off both introductions for our next organizers. So Rob Farrell. Rob is an organizer committed to the liberation of all Black people. With family roots in the U.S. Virgin Islands, he is passionate about ending the colonial project and all of its manifestations. Rob came into movement through the frame of direct action and believes in the transformational power of direct action and political education. Rob is a lifelong learner and teacher, and he works as a lead trainer in the Elevator Organizing Institute to build the capacity of the next generation of Black organizers. Rob rarely leaves home without his camera and is dedicated to archiving Black-led movement spaces with documentary photography and fine art portraits. Check out his work on IG at @BMore_radical, all over. Rob enjoys cooking, refereeing soccer games, taking care of his 50+ houseplants, playing with his cat Oshun, and shelling down any heat or pond. As founding member of Organizing Black, Rob is joined to help build a Black organizing institution in Baltimore City, capable of creating radical change in the living conditions of ordinary Black folks locally, nationally, and globally. Thank you, Rob. And our next speaker is Obasi, really short. Obasi is a founding member of Ujima People's Progress Party and currently co-chair of the Agitprop Committee. So thank you, Rob and Obasi. And again, whichever one you want to go first, with just 5 to 7 minutes, just introducing yourself and how you and talk more about your work.
Okay, yeah, my name is Obasi Kamara, but I'm also known as Jermaine. My mama's name is Jermaine, so shout out to my mom. Yeah, I'm one of the founding members of the Ujima People's Progress Party. A lot of the comrades that I met from Ujima, we came out of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, and my comrade Namdi at the height of the Barack Obama election of debacle. My comrade Namdi had the sense of mind enough to recognize as a revolutionary that the people were at the polls, that the people were excited to be at the polls, and that's one area of struggle where a lot of activists have not really paid attention to. So we had decided to come up with an alternative to be able to interject, because what happens is the Democratic and Republican parties have been controlling and dominating working class and black communities, for years. And we still get the same results, and we still, in the same situation. And also when there's not, when the working class don't have their own ideology, then we have a tendency to adopt the ideology of the ruling class. And that's what we have been done, and that's what's been perpetuated. So we decided to create our own electoral party. It is not just an electoral party. We recognize that elections and politics is not the end-all, be-all. We recognize that it is not the main solution to our issues. We recognize as an area of struggle that needs a black working class ideological interjection. And also, we don't want to replicate the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. We are a black power organization, who wants to be on the ground 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, engaging in struggles that represent the black interests. So, but also we want to be able to interject our ideology in the electoral process. And if we win, that's great, because, we want to run candidates from the community, that are able to represent the community and not these folks who don't live here. So if we win, that's great, but winning is not the end-all, be-all, because we look at it as an organizing tool that we can go back to and organize folks. So either if we win, that's great, because we get to occupy that democratic space, and people who have more advanced involvement can do what they're going to do. But if we don't win, we can still go back and organize folks, because that's our main objective, is to organize folks. So the state says we need 10,000 signatures to get on the ballot. That has been an uphill battle, and we've been trying to get that done. That's one of the obstacles they put in place to maintain the two-party system. So that's where we're at now. We're still trying to get on the ballot, and we're still, still on the ground doing what it is we have to do. So that's where we're at right now, as far as
So my role in Organizing Black is senior organizer. I run our campaign to defund the police. I would say about our campaign to defund the police that we see it as probably the greatest point to make an intervention. In this larger context of like imperialism, colonialism, all these systems of violence, policing is where the rubber meets the road for black people, right? This is where we see our oppressor on a daily basis in our face. And so for me, it was both tactical in the idea of like, this is where money can be taken and invested in other parts of the budget, but it's also a point of intervention to have these larger conversations around politics, to have, to create a fulcrum for political education for folks. And so the way that my work generally is structured is oriented around capacity building. By that, I mean building the capacity of young black people to organize themselves in their communities. And so we run these campaigns, these canvases, these experiments with young Black people to teach them these ways of engaging with people so that they can go and do that in their other organizations or in their other spaces to raise the tide for the city at large. And I would say that for a smaller organization, it's hard to do that work tactically at the same time as trying to make these great shifts in the larger ecosystem. So that's something that we are struggling to manage and to deal with, but it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I would say, I'll probably leave it at that, because I think I'm more interested in the back and forth of the question answer session. Yeah, I'm telling you, my family's from the Virgin Islands. You go to the Virgin Islands, you'll see Gucci Lane everywhere.
That's some old school
It
stuff.
really is.
All right, so for the first question, it has to do with police abolition. Do you think the dynamics of the intercommunal violence that exists in our communities has deterred people from the notion of police abolition? And how does that get addressed with working class communities? And either of you can speak up.
Yeah, I would say yes. When I talk to folks canvassing or at events or whatever, intercommunal violence is probably the number one topic area of interest or thing that needs to be addressed in our community. So when we say defund the police, they're like, all right, so who's going to keep me safe? Right? And this is the entire conversation around police abolition and defunding in general. Who keeps us safe? When we say we keep us safe, right? But what does that really mean to someone who's not politicized? Who do I call? And so, yeah, how do we deal with that? I think the process of abolition has to be understood as not of just destroying, but of creating, right? And so what are the interventions that we're going to create that are going to give our people tools to deal with the violence that we have in our communities? And so, yeah. The other thing that I think is really important to understand around the objections is that all of that is internal. It's an internalized politic around who has power and who doesn't. And when people don't think that they have any power over their lives or their situation, they are then going to defer that power to someone else. And that's probably the biggest point of struggle, is like getting someone to understand that you have the power to deal with conflict in your life, in your situation. And the larger institutional piece is how do we build systems that allow folks to do that together. But yeah.
Yeah, you said how has the intercommunal violence, has it deterred people from, you said concepts of police abolition?
Yes.
I think that, well, since the days of since they've been snatching us up, trying to get away from the plantation, containment and police presence has always been the state's solution to our problem. And we know that, crime and internal violence is a byproduct, especially black crime. It's just nothing but a byproduct of white on black violence. That's always been a like the fallback for the state is to contain us and to police us. But until we, as working class people, because the people's loyalty to the state is fickle. You know what I'm saying? The reason why people, believe in state institutions because there is no alternative. There's no viable alternative. And we recognize that with the destruction of the Black Revolution in the 60s and 70s when they destroyed everything. So until we create a viable solution, until we create, and that's what Ujima is trying to do, build institutions that are viable enough to compete with the state and create a safer alternative, then yes, people are always going to fall back to believing that the state can solve their problems. So we have to build dual and contending institutions, to give the people a viable alternative. So until then, I believe that the correct answer is yes. I agree with you.
The other thing that I would add to that is when you're talking about building viable alternatives to the state institutions, I think that another critical avenue of intervention is mutual aid. talk about meeting the needs of people, we have the ability to meet our own needs, collectively meet our own needs. And again, when we talk about taking the locus of control from being external, moving it into internal, mutual aid is a place where that can happen, where relationships can be built, where politicization can happen. And so it's not just the interventions with crime, with harm that's happening within our communities, but it's also how do we survive in this fucked up ass state together.
Thank you both.
Okay, so our second question. Campaigns like defund the police has taken off in Baltimore City. However, Baltimore City politicians do not have full decision-making control over policing. How has this been a hindrance for organizations?
Yeah, I think the wording of this question is interesting because, yes, BPD is a state agency. And what that means is BPD is legislated by Annapolis. But BPD is funded by the local government, by the city council and the mayor. So the mayor and the city council have the authority to cut the budget of BPD without any intervention from Annapolis. And so I think that's a point of clarity that needs to be understood by everyone is the mayor and the city council have the authority to take money from police and then reinvest it in other areas. The roadblock, the primary roadblock to that has been the consent decree. The primary roadblock to defunding the police has been the consent decree.
What's that?
Okay, for sure. I can break it down for you. The consent decree is a legal agreement between the federal government, the Department of Justice, and the City of Baltimore. And what that agreement is intended to do is to correct the unconstitutional policing practices of the police department by putting in a series of reforms.
Right.
And so what it essentially is a contractually mandated reform system where you have to continually funnel money and resources into policing for them to change themselves and make themselves better.
So the police are, or the police body is regulated by the state, and like the state is like fixing its own problems. So it's like a self-contained mess in itself.
And we'll actually talk about that.
Yeah, we will. I just wanted to make that point of clarity is that, and thank you for your question. Just wanted to make that point of clarity that the BPD is funded by the local government and legislated by Annapolis. And so it's been that back and forth of, well, we can't cut because we have the consent decree in place, and the city will be moved into receivership, which is a legal penalty that's levied upon the city for not abiding by the consent decree. That's been a real struggle.
I just want to say it also is a system that like channels federal funds into, so that they use a lot of like federal, really like military. Because it invites in like U.S. Marshals and FBI and ATF to like collaborate and help out local cops, but like they don't have the same rules like U.S. Marshals and ATF and FBI don't have their body cams. So it's like, what is he going to grant? The rules are now that their body cams, but they don't have them because they're on the federal task force and they love task forces.
To your point about the federal funding, that's Operation Relentless Pursuit. So that was established under Trump in 2020, I believe, right when he left, so Trump and Barr established that. And then, interestingly enough, there's 3 other cities, I think it's 7 cities in Operation Relentless Pursuit, but 3 of them, 2 in Ohio are also under a consent decree. So that just seems to be the trajectory of once you get your consent decree that says your police department is bad, then they send in the federal police in.
So consent decree and community policing are both scams, and they're stealing your taxpayer money, which is the question, which is the last question. why do you feel calls for police accountability always result in community policing and consent decree? It happens across the nation, including in Baltimore. So why does it result in that? And how can organizing to defund the police and building community control these kinds of changes and result in more accountability instead of them always throwing community policing and consent decree at us?
I don't know. I think that they probably throw it at us because it doesn't necessarily change the power dynamic between the people and the police. So that's probably the main reason why they keep coming up with these same solutions that doesn't empower us. What was the other one?
Yep, so the last part is how can organizing to defund the police build community control and change this scam that they keep throwing at us for generations?
Yeah, I think, community control and defunding the police in the eyes of, you still subject to the capitalist patriarchal structure. But I think one of the ways it can benefit us because it does create a space, for more alternatives, to help alleviate that particular it creates more alternatives because at the end of the day, the whole idea of policing is anti-Black, and that's just at its core. So organizing around these two things can at least give us an opportunity to create a space for something, for another alternative. And plus, I think the whole idea of policing, in a sense, in this whole thing moving forward, has to be redefined. Because every time we think of policing, we always think of, the patriarchal capitalist way of keeping our communities safe without looking at it, dialectically and its interconnections between socioeconomic and anti-Black womanness in its essence. So I just think that it would help us create space for more alternatives.
Okay. Rob, you want to throw something in there?
Yeah, so can you restate the question really quickly?
Good gracious, y'all. All right, so community policing and consent decree scams, right?
Sure.
All right, so how do you feel calls for police accountability always result in that? Those are always the two things.
Yeah.
And that's years, right? So first off, why do you think police accountability always results in those two things?
Yep.
And how can organizing to defund the police and building community control the changes that we need for police accountability?
Yeah, I would just first say that calls for accountability to police are a farce.
Mhm.
Like, the police can't be held accountable because they're doing exactly what they're paid and intended to do. So, yeah, these structures like consent decrees and community policing are tools for reform built on the idea that policing as an institution can be saved. And so an intervention just needs to be made that just says that's not possible and that we actually just need to go in a different direction. And I think that's the unfortunate part of the organizing that happened to establish the consent decree here in Baltimore. Now we're in this situation where we're fighting a legal binding contract between the city and the federal government. And if we buck out of it, then some really serious financial penalties can be levied on the city. I don't think an institution that was built on literally catching slaves can be reformed in any way, shape, or possible. And how can our organizing change this dynamic? So for me, it's like actually using this opportunity to have conversation with Black people about this larger political system that we're in and the function of policing within it, understanding a class analysis and communicating that to Black folks so that it's not just about policing, but it's about the entire structure. So we're not just talking about abolishing police, we're talking about abolishing the state as a whole. Because we can't abolish police realistically without abolishing capitalism, without abolishing the state. It's just like those things are interconnected and can't be separated in a real way. And to your point, like it's an opportunity to make interventions and create systems of survival and care for our people as alternatives so that this momentum, progress, movement can actually grow. Because until folks have an opportunity to enter, an opportunity to see how it can tangibly benefit themselves, it just seems like fucking make believe. Like we're talking about unicorns that will never exist. But if they see that mutual aid can actually help them survive, like right now, right? If they see that transformative justice or a form of mediation can actually intervene in a conflict that can prevent somebody from being shot or killed, or that an organization or a group of people actually cares about their family and family members after they are murdered. Like all of those things really matter in this larger context. So it can't just be around, well, policing are bad, police have to go. Like all of these alternatives and systems have to be built right now to make this sustainable and realistic for working class people. That otherwise, this stuff just doesn't land, it doesn't resonate, it doesn't hit home. It's like almost like you're talking a foreign language.
So thank you both. And so this is important to highlight what you both said, because non-Black people tend not to know history. So they literally only know what they've seen on social media since 2016. They think that Black people are just marching down the street saying, fuck the police. But we've literally for a century demanded all of this. We've demanded changes to schools, police, medical and health. It's not new shit. So whenever any white people or any non-Black people tell you it's a new concept, that's because they've read Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
Ignore them and access the Black people locally who are actually doing real work. So you wanted to say something. This has been a little bit of time. Maybe you want to.
No, we're just opening up for Q&A, so I'm gonna
You
get
want
answers.
to start off?
Less a question, more a statement on police. I kind of wanted to gauge your reaction on it. Policing as an institution in of itself is sort of like, it's less of, not to put a hierarchy on it, but it is more about reinforcing the capitalist social relationship, the sanctity of private property, the violence against, impoverished bodies, creating an upper and lower class. And I very much like what you guys are saying. Obviously, I wouldn't be here if I didn't. But I wanted to gauge is it more important to, I don't know, I didn't have a real question. I just wanted to say that and gauge your reaction about it. Get your thoughts on policing, thinking about it less about the voice of blue and more about the how it fits into the superstructure in itself. Policing as also involving militarization, the military, that's our arm of police around the globe, and the way that the United States sees itself as global police,
No, that's a good. No, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's a good point, because what's happening, that's what we see on the local level is just in the microcosm of what's happening on a larger scheme. And what they do to Black people here in our communities, they doing that shit to Black people all around the world. You know what I'm saying? So this is just a reflection of that. So that's a good point there, brother. Right on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I would say that policing functions as the foot soldiers of capitalism and colonialism as a whole, right? And so that's what keeps the system and the institutions running. Whenever there's opposition brought to it, that's who's suck on those people, whether they're used to assassinate people, to imprison people for forever. A lot of our political prisoners and ancestors, living ancestors, are left to rot in jail because of their resistance to the system. And it's when we actually connect the racial analysis to the class analysis that the system trembles. So I appreciate you bringing that.
To go back and forth there, and even policing the violence on the mind, and the violence on how the ideas that are allowed to be thought, or the ideas that are put into popular lexicon. I think policing works as a function of channeling the conversation into something that's safer, quote unquote, that keeps, capitalism capitalism in its place, or keeps people at least just not questioning. I don't want to sound like, I've seen my third eye is open or whatever, but like people don't have a viable alternative, like they said, like they don't have that idea to break through. I like the point about people get excited for elections and people get excited for electoral politics because they are scared, they're angry, they're depressed, this depravity of the system makes them feel a bunch of emotions, and then the only alternative for them to change the system is through electoral politics.
Exactly.
Well,
Oh well,
I
that's
don't
the
believe
only
that.
option that's
Yeah, I don't
presented
believe
that
that
day.
politics is the only way to change the system, but sister, you had a comment back here.
Yeah, peace, y'all. Yes, ma'am. So, first and foremost, thank y'all for y'all's contributions today. And I want to preface this question with naming that there was Open Society Foundation here in Baltimore, Open Society Baltimore. They conducted a blueprint with multiple organizations a couple years back. And what that lifted up was how many Spanish-speaking individuals here in Baltimore City actually want more policing. So I lift that up to ask, how can we as organizers, as people who are part of organizations engaging in the work of movement building for collective liberation, how can we best address how horizontal racism is being used to divide our movements?
That's a great question. Man.
Do you mind if I take it?
Yes, please.
It's an important question, thank you, because so I was integral our organization was integral as part of the facilitation of that survey. So I was door to door or on the street, talking to folks, and we were doing that in collaboration with CASA, who's Spanish speaking, but largely an immigrant focused organization based in Baltimore. And a lot of what I learned through that experience of working with that organization in that survey and in being in relationship with them in general is that a lot of Spanish-speaking folks, Hispanic folks, are immigrants from Central and South America and are definitely afraid of police and police intervening in their lives because of the intersections of immigration and policing. That if police are called, DHS is going to show up at their house, and then their father or mother or family member is going to be deported. And so I'd have to go look back at the survey results to see exactly what you're referencing. And I definitely think horizontal racism exists between the Black communities and Latinx communities, even though obviously there are Black Latinx people. But yeah, I think the way to address that is through solidarity as organizations and as individuals, or not individuals, but groups of folk, and addressing it. How do we name it? How do we build relationships with each other to find ways of creating interventions for our communities? Because policing does impact brown folk and Latinx folk just as severely as it does Black folks, and the statistics show that as far as prison populations and all these deportation and all these things. But yeah, thank you for naming.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. I think you had your hand up as well. Oh, did I imagine that? You might have been fixing your mask. Okay. Anyone else have a quick thought or question? Y'all ain't gonna do no quick thoughts or questions though. You got 2 seconds? All right.
Go back to what he said about the police trying to be, he said police trying to be safer with what they do. I mean, you got police doing these collabs with this young children and athletes and all that, trying to set back and more friendly constantly because I'm not one of the libraries where I live at. They have this big kind of slide up panel of police officer because a Black police officer helping young Black child in class, and I was really
False advertising.
so they constantly do that, and there are festivals kind of gatherings, but they're recruitment and just everywhere involved, and the function is really
Just like they're at the Pride Parade right now. It's the same routine. You wouldn't say something.
It's not quick.
You gonna remember? You wanna write it down? And
I'll
say it
remember.
later? Okay, all right. All right, thank you all, and thank you both.
So this last half of the conference is just conversation with people who are doing direct work in community. But before I start, I just wanted to mention something. On the 16th, Black Alliance for Peace held a conference with the Poor People's Army. For those who are not familiar with the Poor People's Army, they are a grassroots group. I want to say based in Philadelphia, but I do know that they have members all over. They have members here as well. But they do a lot of housing coalition work. They do a lot of work with houseless folks. They this is not repurposed, but they kind of take over empty apartments and get people housed, and they do a lot of that facilitating. They're right now taking on HUD. So it's a big deal. Primarily, one of the reasons why BAP thought it would be it made sense to partner with them and have the press conference was because BAP has something where we call the People-Centered Human Rights campaign. We believe strongly in not just human rights, because those are just individual rights, like the right to nonsense, more than likely. But when we talk about people-centered human rights, we're talking about, when people talk about the right to housing, that's what we're talking, where it comes from. We talk about the right to education, the rights to make people's lives, they can live their best life equitably. So those are the things that we're talking about when we say it, but just a little more concrete definition of it. When we talk about people-centered human rights, it's a framework that proceeds from the assumption that the genesis of the assaults on human dignity that are at the core of human rights violations is located in the relationships of the oppression. So people-centered human rights framework does not pretend to be non-political. It is a political project in the service of the oppressed. It names the enemies of freedom, the Western white supremacist, colonial capitalist patriarchy. So the demands for clean water, safe and accessible food, free quality of education, healthcare, and healthiness for all, housing, public transportation, wages, and socially productive jobs that allow for a dignified life, ending mass incarceration, universal free childcare, opposition to war, and the control and eventual elimination of police, self-determination, the respect for democracy in all aspects of life. Those are just some of the aspects of people-centered human rights. And it can only be realized through a bottom-up mass movement for building popular power. So in that vein, I want to welcome Roger Evans. He is the State Outreach Coordinator, Tenant Organizer for the Ujima People's Progress Party. And I wanted Roger to talk about housing and the mutual aid work that's happening right now in the city. So you can go ahead and do your centering.
Okay, cool. All right. My name's Roger. I would have had a much longer biography. I didn't know he was doing. I like doing stuff outside this. I could talk more stuff. But my name is Roger Evans. I'm the State Outreach Coordinator for UPP. I started doing this work about 3 years ago. I grew up all over the city. Born in Evans Village. Grew up in North Baltimore, then Morgan. Went to church down Patterson Park area. And so when I was in the Patterson Park area, that was growing up in neighborhoods that mostly black. I ain't seen nothing but us all over the neighborhood. So going to that church in Patterson Park was the first time that I had seen gentrification up close without even realizing what it was. I saw the neighborhood start to change, and I started seeing people that that we saw in the corners of every church, and that started to be the typical white girl with a little dog running around the neighborhood. I saw that in action and had no idea what it was. And then eventually, as I was able to word school, I was like, okay, let me figure out what organization can I join that's not what I've seen growing up, and started to figure out how to fight the community level and start to solve these type of things. So I ended up joining UPP and just started doing work in the community with them. And so we just came back from Western Maryland a week ago, trying to reach out to folks out there. So we're trying to build a statewide coalition, dealing with housing all over the state. So I want to give a kind of overview of what housing looked like in Baltimore, kind of who we were, who we are now, where we could go. Who we were is, if you had to break down what housing looked like in Baltimore, pre-Civil War, there was like the Congress said earlier, Baltimore had the highest population of free black folks that existed in the country. Black folks in the city lived in the alleyways. White folks in the city lived on the main streets. The alleyways were domesticated workers that served the white folks that lived in the city. So, and around in Civil War times, post-Civil War, as the state started industrializing, you saw a bigger population of black folks coming up from the South. It wasn't exactly the Great Migration yet, but it was black folks coming up from the South, and they were coming for the jobs that were, Bethlehem Steel was coming, other organizations were coming, and they started to develop around the city. And so around that time, the only way that a black family could afford to buy a house was if a white Jewish family had a house, because there was no white folks. It was de jure segregation. With no white folks were just selling to black folks unless you were Jewish family, because they got discriminated against also. And so this is also the time where you had racial covenants, you had blockbuster. But what existed, and it started right around here. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen the actual red map. Everybody knows what red line is, and that's sure what red line is. But I don't know if anybody's actually seen a map of what it looks like. So I blew up this neighborhood in this block. And if you look, if you can see, if I circled the little, if you can look at the little circle, that's this block. This block was in the yellow part of the map. It was broken down to 4 codes: green and blue were the better neighborhoods. Yellow and red were the ones that they said that the federal loans that wouldn't guarantee any loans given to anybody else neighborhoods, mostly black. This block was in the yellow part. If you go further down the street, it was red, and if you go in typical Baltimore fashion, blue was for like up and around street around the corner. So if anybody goes up in the city, you can tell the neighborhoods where it's been investment, and it hasn't been neglected, and how the homes are $1 million right next to homes that are like $30,000. That's a legacy of the line, and you see it up and down the blocks anywhere you go. So around that time, and actually the history was made about 7 minutes around the corner from here, 834 McCullough Street. That was the first. There was a prominent black lawyer who existed in that time who brought a house on that street. He brought the color barrier of that McCullough block, and his law partner wanted to buy another home on that block. And at that point, the what became the precursor to redlining was called Ordinance 610. Ordinance 610 said that no black person could move on a block of white people that was majority white, and vice versa. So before you had any red line that occurred, you had this ordinance that was in place, and it was struck down 7 years later as unconstitutional. But you had 7 years of those predatory practices that still affect the city to this day. And you also, it was called blockbuster. Like I said, I was born in Evanston Village. If you knew anything about Evanston Village, it was one of the first areas to be blockbusters. But what happened is they would play on white folks' fear about black people moving to the city by having a young black mother take a stroller with a baby in it and just walk down the street into the neighborhood. They would do that to make white people think that black folks were coming in and trying to take over the neighborhood. And as a result, they were able to get white folks to do the white flight and go out to the counties. They bought the homes and then sold them back to black folks at higher rates. A lot of times they sold them at contracts. Contracts mean that they didn't even own the homes. That was just, you pay us this amount of money and then you don't get the building equity off these homes. So that's what it looked like around the time before you get the Great Migration. Once the Great Migration happens, and then and our population hits close to 1 million. We're at 600,000 a day. At this point, Baltimore had the highest population it had in history. It was about close to 1 million people. Now you get the building of Lafayette Homes, Flag House, Murphy, Perkins, all the high-rises that anybody's growing in the city is familiar with, and all those developments, those came as you get the Great Migration of black folks coming up from the South. And most of those buildings are torn down now. Public housing in the city has been progressively destroyed, has been aggressively taken away. There's no plans to build on public housing. Most of these homes were neglected. Most of these homes were they didn't take care of them. They didn't invest in them. They wanted to segregate black folks in a certain part of the city, not allow them to move outside of that. So we had blockbuster and racial covenants, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so fast forward to now. Most people know, if you don't know, it's about the Highway to Nowhere. Highway to Nowhere displaced approximately 1,500 black families in West Baltimore. It was meant to basically destroy the neighborhood that existed. It destroyed the neighborhood that existed there, but it was meant to connect county folks, white folks who moved out to the county, to the city. Allowed them to come to the city, never interact with black folks, so they built through the city, built through the neighborhood, and nothing ever happened to it Something's supposed to be done with it during the infrastructure plan. That's not going to happen, but there was plans in place. 2000 and 2013, Baltimore seen the fifth highest rate of gentrification out of all the cities in the U.S. Station North, Green Mount West, most of the places are fancy now that have been gentrified. Home values have gone from about 65,000 to 200,000, and the black population has decreased in these neighborhoods during that time. Baltimore is unique in terms of gentrification because, unlike most places, it extends from the institutions that existed. Hopkins being the main one. Johns Hopkins, Henrietta Lacks. Johns Hopkins has been stealing from black folks since they've been stealing since been stealing. And the way they've done it in housing is that they recently demolished an entire lifestyle of black homes that existed that could have been used for housing for the people in the neighborhood. Hopkins bought it, sat on it, let it go into disrepair, and demolished it. In the process, Hopkins also developed their own police force. And this is where you start to see the intersection of what housing and gentrification is with policing, where Hopkins has their own private police force. Well, they tried, and the community has fought back against them forming their own private police force, but they're still going forward. And that private police force is unaccountable to anybody, and their job is to basically be the barrier between us and the university. So Hopkins, and then that's on the school side. On the hospital side, Hopkins has tried to develop the Middle East part of the city. Folks, when they protested against the Middle East, they said that if we get pushed out there, we're not coming back, we're going to arrest them. And the council once again used that as in collaboration with the institution like Hopkins, we use to keep people from being able to afford their housing. And so it follows the same pattern that you see in cities like Atlanta, cities like Oakland, where like a cop in Atlanta said, I quit my position on the force because I recognized they were sending me in neighborhoods to do development directed policing. They were purposely sending me in neighborhoods to put felons on these people because the developers couldn't kick them out because of Section 8. So the police went in there, they said, we're going to give everybody, I think we can felonies, nuisance calls, everything we can to get the process starts to clear y'all out, let the developers come on in, let them know cheaper rate. And so that's where we are right now in Baltimore specifically. Where we could be going is, the best example of this is what happened in West Oakland. West Oakland in 2020 building up 2020 has seen gentrification levels that the entire city has become livable to working class black and brown folk. And in 2020, a group of moms called Moms for Housing decided to sit on a house that existed there, and it was owned by Westwood Properties. And at the end of a 2-month-long process, they were forcibly evicted using tanks and AR-15s. And so when the state decided, in cooperation with developers, that it's time for y'all to go, they use the method they always use to force everybody out, just the cops. Those are the boots on the ground. It's the tip of the spear for developers in the state to work side by side. But there's a silver lining in it is that they were able to, they fought with the city, they fought with the developer company, they managed to agree to buy the house, put in the community land trust, it's affordable for that. So that's the positive side of what can happen. But in my mind, community land trusts are all well and good, but they tend to take a long time to form. There's capital needs to be done to buy homes and everything. An individual level, what you can do now is start to organize. If you're a renter, organizing your buildings wherever you at. Talk to your other tenants in the building. Talk to the older folks that live in senior homes and start to organize themselves in tenant unions. And there's a long history of what tenant unions have been able to accomplish. In Mexico, there was a tenant strike that was sparked by sex workers in Mexico. Decided we're not going to take it no more. We're going to start. 30,000 people across the city got involved. Barcelona saw renter strikes in the 1930s. Ireland saw renter strikes. You saw renter strikes tenant unions have been in existence for years. Most people just don't know about it.
Right.
So UPP and what our housing thing and what our housing arm is, they started developing like goals of going into each community, letting folks know that tenant unions is a possibility that exists. Start to fight for your rights. And while it's okay, it's cool to fight for better conditions in the building and fight against rent increases. The long-term goal is for the tenant union to become revolutionary and just take the building for the 9 years. And so there's only one way to decouple housing from the commodification of profit moves. That first we just got to realize we outnumber them.
Right.
They're not coming into the buildings. It's our building now. So that's the long-term goal we're trying to do. But the whole goal is that organize at the community level to fight for better housing, at the same time recognizing that police are the tip of the spear when it comes to developers in the state with a hand in hand.
Thank you. You covered that, but to what extent is, like, we see the fight with Douglas and Hopkins, that's a legitimate fight, but to what extent do we see that replicated? And how does the Housing Coalition intervene? Because a lot of what the fight back is with Douglas Homes is that they have established a housing coalition. But it's the same, I think you noted, like DC had the same process where they were knocking on doors and offering people a check that they could move somewhere else, without any regard to the price of living going up, the cost of living going up, and then the gentrification that was happening. But with the left, their public housing, they couldn't afford nowhere, even with the money that was given, because rent keeps going up or changing yearly. So how do we see the fight back intervene in those spaces? Like, what is how did the security force pump its brakes? You know that it's still going forward, but how did the coalition itself?
Back for Hopkins Private Security Force, there was a coalition. I know a lot of Hopkins students themselves stayed sittings at Hopkins and administrative buildings because they recognized that this police force was going to do nothing but harm to the surrounding community. And so they decided to take a radical action of saying, we're not going to class, we're not going home, we stand right here to keep government building this. And at the time, it paused. It was also around the time of the George Floyd protests. So Hopkins, one of the good PR was like, all right, we'll hold off on this, we'll chill off of this for now. But July 2021, they decided we want to ramp it back up again, hire some black cop from Cambridge, Massachusetts to do the force or that like that. But I think the central point is that the only method to stop it wasn't just to raise awareness about it, but to go to the next level of saying we're not letting this space be taken over. We're going to occupy this space and use our bodies and use what we have to keep government letting us go forward. And it's going to need to happen again. Because Hopkins going to keep trying. They're going to keep trying to develop it. They're going to keep trying to poke holes in whatever we have to make sure they get their own police force. So organize at the community level, organize with the neighbors and students, anybody that's willing to come along and laws and principle, that's what you do.
And is the ultimate goal community control of housing? And if so, what does that look like in a city like Baltimore?
See, like Baltimore, there's in existence now, there's about several co-ops that exist that most people don't know about, and mostly senior homes. Yeah, there's senior co-op homes that exist already. And most of those seniors, they pay about $300 to just cover basic expenses in the city. And there also exists a place called Olmsted Gardens. Now, I went to Curley High School right next to it. I wasn't going to Olmsted Gardens. It wasn't. No, I was scared of death to go inside there. But that place existed. I mean, it was different. It was different over there. But it existed. It came to exist because once again, it was meant for black people. It was a co-op, and those homes over there are permanently affordable in perpetuity because black folks and people organized to get together and make that area that way. It's not population. It's not demographic-wise that way now. But that was what it started off as. So in Baltimore, there's so many different vacant homes that exist, and while Lowe's Green is trying to do the dollar homes and all that, and not even considering the fact that most people can't afford to renovate the homes in the first place, it's going to take once again organizing to develop community land trust long-term goal, but also in my work with the Baltimore United and how UBP has been working with them too. We just been starting to talk to folks in every building in the city. Like most folks don't even realize, look, your landlord may not even have a license to have a home in the first place.
Right.
So it starts off with political education, let people know your landlord could owe you a whole bunch of money. You don't even realize. Like if the information is there at SDOT, look up your landlord. They may not have a license, and they may not even be able to charge you rent. So it's getting out there to folks and educating politically about what's available and how to know your rights and tenant advocacy, as well as developing models like the Black Panthers want to start land banking in Chicago. Land banking allows you to collect enough money to buy off land, just put it inside land bank. Lemon equity corporations, community land trusts, worker co-ops, and once again, just deciding that the building's ours now. So there's a lot of different forms for it to happen. But Baltimore has enough vacant homes and enough property in West Baltimore, East Baltimore, whatever like that, at a certain point we are organizing them to say, we just want to move into this building. We want to fix everything the way we can, but we want to make sure it belongs to the community.
I did have one other question. In terms of policing, Okay, so what we have been seeing across the nation is a sense of like moved in evictions or evictions by intimidation. So how does that affect how we're seeing housing? Because there's this whole thing about buying back the block, right? And that has been causing the increase or the uptick of move-in evictions because people are definitely selling their homes while tenants are in there still paying rent. So people are moving in while they're rent-paying tenants, and they're trying to intimidate them out of the house. We had a comrade in Philadelphia that recently went through that. There's several cases in New York. But I'm wondering if we're seeing this concept of, that sort of home ownership, what is the distinction between a buy black to block and a community control, and how does that invite policing?
Buy back the block, in my opinion, what I've seen doesn't actually seek to dismantle the hierarchy of the landlord owning the property and the people paying 30, 40, 50% in rent to them. I've never seen a buy back the block that doesn't say, okay, we're as an entity, we're going to be landlords of the property. We're going to buy the property. We're still going to, and folks are still going to be paying market rate or close to it for those homes. So community control, what community control housing does, it says there's no profit motive. The motive of this housing is simply to house people and to give people decent quality homes that they can have in as long as they live. So, and buying back up, Jay-Z tried to do it. There's a few different organizations in the city that have been attempting to do it as well, but they run into the same issues of capital. A lot of those places can't even raise the capital to buy the homes in the first place, and what ends up happening is that investors coming to the city, and as we've seen during the pandemic, BlackRock, other investor organizations just buy up all the properties as it is. So the buy back the block thing, I think that was effective before the pandemic happened. Once the pandemic happened, the model changed, and what it looked like to buy a property in the city changed. Investors have been buying up DC, Atlanta, Charlotte, most of the homes in the South where black people still reside in high numbers. Those are the places that the investors are coming up and snatching up. And so, it's like you said, it's the buy back the block concepts are there, but I think a bigger beast now is just that, like, most of these homes that we see now, those are owned by some faceless company way off and whatever, and they're just waiting out. They're waiting out for for the gentrification process to start, which means that there's more nuisance calls to the police, more 301 calls that don't even require police presence in the first place. So I think that's what it's going to look like. But I think it's easier to organize against a faceless corporation that doesn't have the capacity on the ground to really stop a lot of organizing. So.
Does anyone have any questions for Roger? Yeah.
How, this person's Gilmore, how do you know where people go, when they're going?
Some groups keep track of it. Like there was when Middle East went through what it went through, most of the folks got pushed out of there. There was just individual community groups that kept track of where folks ended up after that process happened. And in the case of Middle East, out of the hundreds of people that ended up being pushed out, only 35 came back. And most of the folks that got pushed out could no longer afford the neighborhoods that they got pushed to because while they got money to get rid of the homes, the property taxes in those neighborhoods were untenable for them. So most of the time that tracking happens by some independent community group that just keeps up with people over a long time.
Any other questions for Roger? Yeah.
So I think my professor, I asked her a question about like city layout and social justice last time. So the hyper segregation in the city is which
Black butterfly, white elf.
I think so. Yeah. So hyper segregation is because of red line. The hyper segregation is because of that. So where you can be in Mount Vernon, Boston College, and then next thing you know, square. It's like, what is this?
Bolton Hill, Mount Vernon, all that type of area right there. If York Road, if you're familiar with the city of York Road, you drive down York Road in Guilford. Like my family grew up on the black side of York Road, and in their house they've never been worth more than what it is now. The homes on the other side, routinely, my mother worked at Hopkins in the Plain Giving, so she saw the money coming into Hopkins. Those whole entire areas are Mayberry in comparison. Like if you could draw, like you can literally draw just a line down the middle of the street and see $3 million homes, $40,000 homes. So it just, that's what makes Baltimore kind of weird in that way, is that it butts right up against each other.
Any other questions? Comment?
I don't have a question. I have a comment.
Yeah.
You mentioned how the how these homeowners, decide to go ahead and sell houses from other people. Now, I was homeless in 2019. My house was sold twice. The house that I was living in 2020, after moving from that space, which was unsafe, the landlord had multiple violations. I always passed my inspections for aesthetics, for maintenance, for household cleaning. You know, it was a government property because, to be honest, I decided after 20-something years of being on that list, and like, oh, you got a voucher, you're out for this program. So I took it. I used it. $1,400 rent was getting paid, and the property owner, and unfortunately, he had skin just like mine, unfortunately, and he just didn't do anything in that space. It was a big, pretty mess. It was a beautiful place, but it was a mess. Water issues, flooding constantly because of improper and shoddy maintenance and shoddy carpentry work and all that kind of stuff. So I moved from that space, and I was a nomad for like 2 years. So I settled into another space in 2020, 2522 West Franklin Street. Homeowner decided that he didn't want to make repairs. The first night I was in there, I turned on the shower, and my ceiling leaked. The floor flooded. That's when the flooding began. The basement flooded several times. How we need a burst. HVAC system went up. The pipes for that burst and flooded my house again. So he decided to sell it because he said he could no longer maintain the space. And I'm like, well, what are you doing with my money now? This place, I was paying him cash.
Right.
He didn't even have a tenant for it first. He came to my home and picked up the cash. So he sold this house to his friend. And his friend was upset because he still hadn't done the work that he promised that was going to be done. So he just dumped the mess on his friend. Needless to say, I left that space in October with all the flooding. And there's a new person in the house, a woman with 2 small children. I went to go pick up mail, and she said she got there a few weeks ago, and the flooding has began again. What can we do to stop this? Because this is something that this man cost me a lot of money. A lot of money. I'm living in a little apartment now. I pay my little money to this crappy landlord as well. That's why my next move is to have my home. But what can we do to stop this? Because this literally happened to me and my family. Me and all my art and all my stuff had to pop in this little teeny space because somebody wanted to say, "Oh, I'm gonna get this house. It's gonna be my cash cow. It's gonna be my cash flow." And take advantage of somebody like me and pat their pockets while I pay expenses and costs. Because I made a lot of repairs in both of those houses. And I trained my son. I taught him how to do carpentry and stuff. So we did this stuff. We did what he was supposed to do. So how can we stop this?
Yeah, you're talking about two aspects that's really important. One is inspections.
And yeah.
Most folks don't know that in the city, you know, when a landlord is only required to have 10% of their units inspected in their building. So they don't 100 units, and they get to pick which 10 units get inspected. So if they want to get in there and show it, just make it look like everything's all together. Under the current laws, as long as the inspector come and they know the inspectors.
And I called my own inspector who cited him for multiple violations.
Exactly.
From the HVAC system to mold issues to the carpet hadn't been changed. You know, we lived there and supposed to change the carpet periodically. They're really supposed to paint the house fresh unless you allow you to do it yourself every so often. Not supposed to have that old paint on there. Checking the ducts and HVAC. We are all asthmatic. We all have neurological conditions in my household. I'm autistic. I'm epileptic. My babies all had it. Well, they had asthma, but I healed them. Living in a space like that will only exacerbate the condition or bring about the symptoms and cause me sick again. I've been sick from living in other people's houses and I'm paying money for that are not giving me the quality space that I'm paying for.
Right.
So that's what I want to negate that. Can you guys help me? Tell me who I need to call. I called an inspector. He called his friend, and his friend said, "Oh, you good?" And then she cited me for a little shredded piece of carpet in the corner. My house was immaculate, so that was bull.
Yeah, I would contact one of Bruce's Baltimore Renters United because we're currently organizing a building called Landville Towers that's right on Harper Road, not that far from me, and they're going through the exact same thing. Most of the tenants in that building, black mold, unsafe, and like the doors don't stay locked. They just got access community room back because they organized for it, but they also didn't have a lot of heating issues too. So this building, they basically was like, look, as an individual, nothing's getting accomplished in our hand. As a community, we can start to organize together to start to get folks to answer for this. And so in a short amount of time, they went from not having access to the community room and some of the folks not having none of the issues addressed. They started organizing, making fuss, and now the councilman over there, Stokes, who's been there forever, ain't doing shit. But he's been there forever.
Stokes is the word.
And now all of a sudden he's showing up on Zoom calls like, hey, what's up? What's up? What y'all need?
He's
he's in charge of most of the houses.
Yeah, he's over there. Yeah,
Most
so
of
like,
them
you know,
are.
he ain't doing shit. He drive past the buildings all day long. He know what's going on. But everybody started making fuss. And he was like, all right, well, at least I gotta show up. And not like you're gonna do something, you know. And I like to take it from the approach where there's certain things that can be done under the rule of law to just say, all right, we can check off these boxes. Everybody did 311 calls. We had inspections come in. We did everything we were supposed to do under what y'all told us to do to make sure these things are attended to. And at a certain point, what the landlords do is that they'll just they'll wash their hands of it, change their name under another LLC and do this shit again in another part of the city.
That's exactly what this dude.
Yeah, they'll just change the LLC. They'll hop behind the LLC and just go to another building and do the exact same thing. So in my mind, one thing you do is exposure. Like it takes more. Look, and it's going to take, you know, and most folks don't like to be all out open on what they're going through. But like, I would rather you had like a little inspection thing you can have on restaurants says A+, B+. Do that shit for a landlord. This landlord's been here, and look, now windows ain't got fixed, man. My heat ain't got fixed, whatever. None of this stuff is getting fixed. This is his name. This is his mailbox. Call his ass. Let him know.
I got receipts. I have screenshots stuff he sent to my email.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, but call to the bottom of yeah.
Perfect. We'll fix it when we can.
Yeah, part of it is just going to be being more open on what you're going through. It's just like talking about your wages on the job. Like, most folks don't want to talk about how much they make on their job, but the moment you start talking about it, you realize once we all get screwed over, let's organize together. Same thing when it comes to your homes. So I recognize that the folks down the street going through the same condition you're going through. It's going to take us to talk to each other and become more social with each other and to just start to organize together. You know, like there's people talking about him being black. That don't mean shit about it. Most of the folks screwing us over are just like us. I mean, so like, you know, one of the buildings that we want to get to now is called Apostolic Towers. It's over there by the post office. It was bought out. It was bought and created by a black church. There used to be the first one of those first apostolic, whatever like that. The building has been disrepaired for about 30 years. If you go on Google now, the old folks are like, look, roaches everywhere, elevators everywhere. Everything has been terrible for us. And it's been black folks, but just that's why I'm here in the first place.
Right.
I was like, it's a whole bunch of people who look like me in the high places. They ain't doing shit for none of us. Let me find somebody who's gonna do the same thing.
Right,
so like that, it be a black person don't mean nothing. It's all
You're right.
Black
And
people. It's all black people.
I'm learning that if I'm
Sorry.
silent about my pain, people think I enjoy it. So I've been speaking out a lot about some of the things that bother me, including my neurological condition and everything, because I found out that there are more people like me than I thought.
Capitalism
I'm not
isolated.
alone.
It's like capitalism
I
isolated.
have
Yeah.
isolated myself.
It's isolated like that.
problems and just try to be super lean and take care of everything myself. I don't even have to. But no, I'm not. We need help. That's why we're here in the community. I realize I need other people.
Exactly. We all live in community, and houses should be right back to that. Thank you for telling me a story, but we should look through housing through that same lens. It's like my grandma ran a soup kitchen in East Baltimore. And everybody that came in there, she ain't never asked somebody, did you budget enough? She ain't asked somebody, did you got financial literacy for that shit? She ain't do none of that. You need food, I'm gonna give you food.
Right.
People need homes, give them homes.
Right.
So it's the same idea. So yeah.
So I want to thank you, Roger, so much. All right, and finally, last but certainly not least, I want to welcome Lisa Snowden to come out. Lisa is editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Beat. Congrats. Previously, she was an editor of Baltimore City Paper, the Baltimore Sun, and the Real News Network. And her work also has appeared in Essence, the Washington Post, Baltimore Magazine, and many other publications. Yeah, all right, so we can start. A lot of the reasons why I asked you to come is I'm an admirer of your work. I know we've done things previously on separate panels around the issue of policing, but I think one of the things that you do distinctively is that you remember the victim and the families in your work, in your writing, and you center your writing around how do we address this in addition to, well, not in addition to, but how do we address this in ways that remembers that these are tied to actual people. So a lot of what I wanted to talk about is, your work around that, because it's very important for us to remember the families and not even just the families, but the direct communities that are affected by what's happening. So one of the things that I want to ask you, hold on, and I'll pull it up. How has the state polluted in the inability to advocate for people in the city whose lives have been turned upside down after interactions with police.
How is the state?
Yeah, like how have you come across in your work seeing the state collude with the inability to advocate for people? Like how has the state sort of intervened or
I mean, I think
directed?
one of the things that we connect on is the Keith Davis Jr. case.
Yeah.
I think that that's so illustrative of how so many forces come together to keep Black people in prison. Like if you guys aren't familiar, Keith Davis Jr. is a man who is about to be tried for the 5th time, making him one of, if not the most prosecuted men in U.S. history. He was shot by Baltimore City Police. They then said that he killed a man up at Pimlico. They have not been able to prove this. This is a thing that Marilyn Mosby, our progressive prosecutor, has pursued over and over again, and has been able to use a lot of different ways to keep him in jail. Keith is a person that we know about because his wife Kelly is a superhero. There are not everybody that can be a Kelly Davis to advocate for him, not just because of all the things that we have talked about, all the ways that capitalism drains our energy and resources and stuff like that. But like at every avenue that Kelly has taken, she's been thwarted. So she's gone to different officials and pled her case. And she's had people even behind the scenes be like, you know what, I understand this seems messed up, but there's nothing I can do. There's ways that Marilyn Mosby has used her power and influence to go and talk about this case and call him a convicted killer, which he's not, on 92Q. So there's just like all these ways that and now, as it looks like, because again, Kelly's amazing, has built resources, has built out the support system. Because she's been so successful, Marilyn Mosby hit Keith with some new charges not too long ago, stemming from a fight in jail. So like alleged fight, yes, very much alleged. Sorry. And so that's what she knows. Like the thing that I talk about is like Marilyn is now facing her own day in court based on her financial decisions, federal court. She and her husband were raising money for this because she knows that these systems drain us. Like you have to have money for lawyers, you have to have time to strategize. And what she has argued that she needs this money for is the same thing that she's doing to Kelly and Keith. So it's just like it's a losing battle. Once they decide any one of us, which is really what propels me in my work. Like any one of us could be on the chopping block. And if the state decides they want you, there's no real way out.
Right. And in Keith's case, I think what makes Keith a prominent case for a lot of us is the ways that there's so many intersections. Like when we talk about the GTTF, there are police that are tied to the GTTF that are also tied to having shot youth. Yeah. The lawyer, not even the lawyer, but the judge, when there was an appeal motion, and he said he couldn't set a precedent. Like that's the first time I ever heard that. First of all, that and then now I'm hearing politicians say that more and more about the filibuster. But this is the first time I ever heard someone say, "Oh, we can't let this go because that will set a precedent." So hearing that the ballistics man who's in charge of that is legally blind does nothing for the judge, who does not want to even hear that, because if he lets this go, how many other cases in the city who have had ballistics testing under this office is going to now flood the courts? So when they shut down Keith, they're shutting down the ability for everyone else to have their day in court. So I think that like I always think about the ways that it's so many, even how many times that Keith was shot. That is a product of the deadly exchanges training. Like they shot at that man over 30 times. They play with the numbers. They say, well, maybe it was less than 30, could have been 40. Like the numbers go back, but it was an excessive amount, bottom line. And that excessive amount is part of the Baltimore PD training with the Israeli Police Department. So I think that every time I think about Keith and the work that we've done, so many of those intersections, it's like, I think that people disregard Keith Davis Jr., one, because Maryland's in that case, and Maryland has a reputation in the city, and people are just, enamored by the representation of it, especially as Keith and not Marilyn and Nick as a power couple, so to speak. So people are just enamored with that. But what I see is that like people's ability to just detach from it by calling it single issue. Like Keith is a single issue case, so that's just a one-off. We can't get too invested in this because we have all these other things. And then I think it's very important to realize that even like you said, it's not just like if there was no Kelly Davis, would we know about Keith? Because how many other names do we not know about because they don't have that force behind them. So yeah, so those are the things that I think about when I think about what you do in your work prominently and what's happening around the city.
If I could also say something else, I think that journalism is such, even though we don't get paid white collar salaries, especially now, it's such a white collar profession that most of the people that are journalists don't look like me. So for them, they're writing about something that they have no connection to. Like they're writing about, Keith Davis Jr., or they're writing about Freddie Gray, or they're writing about whoever. That's not their life in any way. They go back to their life and it's a separate thing. Like for me, I really try to bring the fact that the people that I'm writing about could very much be my family to my work, because otherwise, what is the point? It's not just for me to get like a Pulitzer. Like that's how it is for some people.
Well, to that point, why do you think many of the names of the victims go unheard of?
Because you need to have a PR department. Like Kelly has built that.
Yeah.
She has luckily had people like you, people like Bill Fina, who also is just one of the most brilliant people I know.
Yeah.
And then found like DeRay, who already had built kind of like this following for him. Those are things that don't happen for everybody. Those are just like star-crossed, somebody else is guiding this because it's not accessible. But like Marilyn comes into office and all of that is laid out for her. She has a budget that is determined by her husband.
Right.
She has a PR machine. She has a Twitter that she can use to lie about giving somebody the middle finger. Like she has these things. We do not get these resources. We pay for these resources, but we don't get them. Like another person I want to just lift up is Tawanda Jones, because it's the same thing. They're Kelly and Tawanda are two different people, but they're both just incredibly driven people that have had to build a machine. I couldn't even get here on time today. How could I build a machine if I'm gonna fall or if like one of my loved ones falls into this thing? It's like
Tawanda Jones' case is also another intercepting case because Morgan State Police Department is one of their officers is named as having been one of the officers on the scene.
Oh wow! I didn't even
know
know
Morgan
that.
State has a 1033 program budget, and that's a Department of Defense budget that gives them the sort of militarized weapons that we see during the marches of Freddie Gray when they had the tanks and everything. Mm-hmm. That's a product of 1033. So we have 2 HBCUs in the city that had 1033 budget.
Wow.
So you don't even have to be a student for that to so they are allowed to leave campus and shoot people. Yeah, but a lot of the advocacy, I think, yes, we build a team and you definitely have to have a PR, but I also think that fundamentally people believe in that sort of guilty until proven innocent. And that's a lot of what happened with Keith, because we could say that Kelly built a team, but if we step back and look at the city, there's not any concrete support for Keith in the city.
There absolutely is not, even among groups that claim to be grassroots.
Right.
Advocacy.
Little shake. But that's when I spoke earlier about why we wanted to have this is because there's the first time I seen or envisioned that there could be points of unity for organizations in the cities was when we did the Keith Davis the press room conference. And there was like multiple of organizers. Lab was there, Bree was there, I was there with Ujima. And it was like, okay, so we have a point of unity where we can build around. But then it was like after that, people have, organizations have their prospective work. but there has to be a way to build something through that. And I think that he obviously is one way, but also like understanding what advocacy looks like. Because I think the focus on single issue as a term, or the way that people address our issues, like mutual aid in housing is one thing, the youth and sex work is one thing, you know, and then what's happening to Keith and what's happening with Tawanda and what's happening with Donald Rochester's family, that's a whole other thing. And I think that we need to start seeing it as collectively what's happening in the city as one thing.
I mean, honestly, you have really helped me think about that. Like, I don't know if you remember, I did an interview with you for the Real News when you guys lost your Twitter account, and you were just like saying, and it's something that, like, I already knew that Twitter has a limitation, but our conversation, you really taught me how important it is to endeavor to keep pushing away from social media and make those real life connections. And it's hard because, like, right now for my team, we are a very small team, and we're all believe the same things and are very passionate to be. And we still have little, clashes. So it's like, it's hard work, and it's a special kind of work to figure out how to be in community with people, because we're all, we all are imperfect. But I really appreciate you really speaking out about that part of the work, because I think that Baltimore, because we are so resource starved.
Us. I know about everybody.
Because there is money. Baltimore is a city that has money, but they don't want to, the conversation that we just had, that's what it's redlined away from us. But, like, I think that it's easy for people to, because they want to get that little corner and be like, this is my little corner. So I think it's important and necessary that you guys have started to branch out from that and start moving away from, like, fear and just grasping onto what little things you have.
Right.
And that's been really inspiring to see. Like, I know that the gentleman before me talked about Renters United, and really seeing all those groups coalesce around the various legislation that Nick Mosby has tried to pass has been really heartening and inspiring to me.
So in your work, would you say that your writing is like solution orientated? Like what are some of the working solutions that you see organizations engage in? Or is it more just about reporting as is?
I think it's both. I think it's reporting what happened, but I do think when I see things, like when I was at when the housing stuff was happening, for example, I was at Real News, but I was mostly managed in a leadership role. So I wasn't really writing a lot besides Battleground Baltimore, which was like once a week. So if I could have written more, I would have wanted to write like a longer story about the way that, like, Organizing Black and Jews United for Justice and all those various organizations came to, like, defeat that bad housing bill. Because I think that that's innovative, and it's something that, like, whenever I see basically people doing something that's innovative, I want to highlight it because I want to let other people see it, both in Baltimore and elsewhere, and be like, oh, that's interesting. How can I incorporate that? But I think it's also, like, just writing the thing that happened. Like, journalism is like the first draft of history, is like what the slogan is. So, like, writing just down that this thing happened. Like, I don't think that there's anybody that has written a piece yet that is just like, for the second time in a row, despite overwhelming turnout at taxpayer nights, the budget passed with nobody having problems with the increased police budget. Just writing that down so that people will know that next week and then next year and years in the future, that is a function of journalism also.
I'm thinking about, policing and what it means to report on it, especially in the city, as a Black journalist, and the importance of a publication like the Beat when you have the sun in the background. Like, because everybody knows the Baltimore Sun, but we know that that's skewed. But so, I have some communists, and we believe strongly in independent revolutionary journalism or media. But how do you see the Beat playing an important role in sort of connecting all the issues that we talked about today, and also helping people organize around issues of policing?
it needs to be, I need to make sure that I'm giving space for the people here to be able to have a voice in that paper. Or maybe like the Sun, I remember, sorry, I don't want to keep referencing Organizing Black, but it's just it keeps popping up as I remember the first year that you guys organized, well, not first year, I don't know, but last year, you guys really did work organizing around taxpayer nights. And that's when we really had people showing up. And then the Sun just like never mentioned Organizing Black, and people had to yell at them until they put it in the thing. Like that's something that should never ever happen with the beat. It should literally start with this kind of stuff. Like there was another paper that just started, and they had this big event. It's catered by Atlas, which is, you know, the big monster restaurant group that has done some racist practices. They have big politicians. They have all of that. So they're all kind of doing like signaling, we are all solidarity. We got Brandon Scott taking black and white images. I want the beat to be the opposite of that.
Right.
Like we already had that. I don't need to give Brandon Scott or the Speaker of the House of Annapolis, Adrian Jones, I don't need to give her publicity because she already has a publicity machine, like I said. Y'all don't have that. It's supposed to be a thing where y'all can come and run an op-ed, or you can say, hey, I have this amazing program that I'm launching, can you write about it? And I do that. The other thing that I always talk about the B is like a teaching newspaper.
Yeah.
So like I was talking to Bree, right, I'm so sorry. Yes, Bree. Before this, that like there's not a million of hers, but I wish that there was. Like the reporters that I want to hire don't really exist.
Right.
They do in different parts of the country, but overwhelmingly they don't. Like this other paper had like 600 million that somebody gave them. If I had 600 million and somebody told me to go hire a bunch of reporters, those reporters don't exist yet. So I want to be able to take people that are in Baltimore that can write and have a place to come and learn how to write and get a check from writing, and then you can stay at the Beat and write more for the Beat, or you can take it and go to the Sun, or go to the New York Times, or go wherever you want to go. And that's another way of like hoping that there are other perspectives, because like my whole career, I've been in journalism for like 20 years, and I'm basically always the only one.
Yeah. So before we conclude, does anyone have any questions for Lisa? Or questions in general about everything that we talked about today?
Can you say more about what kind of qualities you need to build or want to see in those journalists that are going to skills?
Sure. Basic skills like learning how to pitch a story to an editor, learning how to write a story, because like I'm not a person that cares about objectivity in journalism, but I do feel like there's ethical ways to be a journalist. So teaching those skills, and also like there's just kind of like skills that you don't teach, that are not openly taught, but that you have to know to just kind of move in those spaces. Trying to think of an example. Just even like the way that you pitch. Like sometimes I'll just have people that'll just send me like an email. It's like, hey, I'm a writer. I want to write for you. And I'm like, okay, there's no clips here. There's no, history. There's no, even like sometimes you didn't even tell me what you wanted to write about. So like things like that are the things that you need to know, just to get in the door. And then also just like being able to learn some of the skills so that you can flip them. So like you will learn, a lot of the journalists that come out of school are taught objectivity. But for me, I want them to be like, that never was a thing. It was never objective, because even if you're objectively writing about a lamp falling over in the street, your decision to who you interview, whether it be a city council person or the neighbor that was trying to tell the city council person over and over this lamp is about to fall down, those are two decisions that influence what the story looks like. So like those kind of things also. Does that help?
Yeah, for sure.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you for your contribution today. And I wanted to ask, how with the climate of violence that's really targeting journalism right now, investigative journalism, here across the world. How do you see that playing out in Baltimore with journalists struggling to like name the things that need to be named?
Yeah. Good question.
That's a good question.
I mean, I literally worry about violence against me because I say a lot of things about the Baltimore Police Department, but so far nothing's happened. I just hope for the best. I got protection oil. I'm prayed up. But people are scared in the city in a lot of different ways. Like, even not the overt physical violence, there's a lot of, how do I put this? Because once you get into these circles where there's like activists and working with politicians and those things, like it's just a small city. Like Baltimore is one of those things where like everybody feels like it's like 2 degrees of separation. So there's a lot of like, okay, so what I'm trying to say is, for example, a few years ago there was a white journalist that was interviewing a woman who has a radio show on TV. And intimated in her question that because Catherine Pugh had been a bad mayor, maybe black women shouldn't be mayors? And rightfully so, a black journalism group was like, hey, what the hell? Like, why are you doing this? There were journalists that were scared to do that, even though they should have. I mean, even though it was like the right thing to do, I'm saying they should have. Because they knew that like, maybe that'll impact my job. There's only but so many journalism jobs to go around. If you're working in these spaces, there's only so many people that you can kind of afford to piss off before you maybe can't, you're totally shut out from any conversation. So it's like those kind of things are also fear. Like I had a city council person today try very hard to shut me down because somebody told me his true feelings about policing. And so, you know, that's a thing that now reverberates around people that are around this person. And it's just like, those kind of things make it harder for a lot of people to speak out.
All right, if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank you, Lisa.
My pleasure.
All of you, we have reached the end of the conference. So I would like to thank everyone for coming out. This is great.